when 34-year-old Rachel Green was found dead from a gunshot wound after a heated argument with her longtime partner, police were quick to consider suicide. But those closest to her weren't convinced. Rachel's journal revealed a woman quietly battling depression while planning to rebuild her life. She had just landed a new job, confided in friends about leaving the relationship, and started packing for a fresh start. Then, she was gone. Witnesses recall a scream and a single shot. Medical findings raised disturbing questions about the gun's position, ones that Dan T align with the official story. This full true crime episode explores the emotional layers behind Rachel's final days and the growing suspicion that her death may not have been a suicide at all. Watch until the end for the evidence that could change everything. On the morning of May 16, 2021, the quiet stillness of a modest neighborhood in Franklin came from a one-story ranch-style house on Oakwood Lane House, where, just hours earlier, 34-year-old Rachel Green had been texting her best friend about picking up boxes. She was packing. She was leaving. She was ready for something new. But by 9:07 a.m., Rachel was dead. Her longtime partner, Michael Jensen, was the one who called 911. His voice, panicked but oddly composed, told the dispatcher it was a fight. "I stepped outside. I heard a shot. She shot herself. I think she's dead." Yes. When first responders arrived, Rachel was found in the bedroom. A gunshot wound to the head. The weapon, a Glock 19 registered to Michael, lay inches from her right hand. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The front door was unlocked. Michael repeated his story. Rachel had been emotional lately. They had argued that morning about finances, about her wanting to move out, about a lot of pressure building. He told officers he stepped outside for air, and when he came back in, she was gone. Initially, it seemed plausible. Rachel had a documented history of depression. Her relationship with Michael had been strained for years, and from the outside, the evidence suggested a tragic end to a troubled story. But those who knew Rachel didn't believe it, because Rachel Green, just days before her death, had begun turning a corner. In the weeks leading up to her death, Rachel Green had started laying the groundwork for something her closest friends hadn't seen in years of future. She had landed a new job at a local marketing firm after nearly a decade of freelance work that she often described as isolating. She'd even joked during a recent brunch with her sister, "Maybe this time I'll have coworkers who Dan T exist only in email threads." But the change wasn't just professional. Rachel had begun attending a weekly support group, quietly at first, showing up late and leaving early. According to the group's facilitator, she rarely spoke during the first few sessions, but gradually opened up about a relationship that had become more controlling over time. She never used Michael's name in the group. She simply referred to him as he, or my partner, and described subtle but persistent efforts to chip away at her independence. Financial control, emotional manipulation, gaslighting. She spoke about feeling like a ghost in her own house. The facilitator later shared in a statement. She said she had to ask to use her own car, that every conversation felt like an argument she didn't remember starting. Yeah, these weren't the words of someone planning to give up. These were the words of someone planning to break free. Rachel's journal, recovered from her nightstand and later reviewed by detectives, painted a fuller picture. Entry after entry detailed her growing resolve to leave the relationship. Her plans to move into a small apartment she had already toured twice, and her fears that Michael wouldn't let her go easily. In an entry dated just 5 days before her death, she wrote, "I can feel it. He knows I'm slipping away. The more I talk about leaving, the more he circles, watching me, asking questions he already knows the answers to. I have to be smart. I can't make this a fight. I just have to be gone." Her friends say she was finally doing things just for herself, reconnecting with old college classmates, talking about travel, joining a gym. There were signs, yes, that she was still struggling with past trauma, but there were more signs that she was fighting to survive it. And that's what made the scene of her death so jarring to those who knew her. The idea that Rachel Green, who had just put down a deposit on her new apartment, who had written her first goal list in years, who had confided to her sister the night before, asterisk, "I think I finally feel ready to go," could have woken up the next morning, argued with her partner, and then ended her life with a single gunshot. It didn't make sense. And it wasn't just emotional intuition that cast doubt on the official story. There were inconsistencies. According to the autopsy report, Rachel had been shot at close range. But the trajectory of the bullet-raised eyebrows entered from behind the right ear at a downward angle. The stippling around the wound was faint, suggesting that the gun was not pressed tightly against her skin. For a right-handed individual to hold a gun at such an angle and fire while seated upright would be anatomically difficult. Not impossible, but unlikely. And then there was the scream. A neighbor across the street who had stepped out to water her plants that morning told investigators she heard a woman scream a sharp, a terrified cry, followed by a few seconds of silence, then a single gunshot. Rachel's death was officially ruled a suicide within 36 hours, but behind the scenes, that ruling began to crack. As pressure mounted from Rachel Green's family and closest friends, the local police department began to quietly re-examine the initial findings. What had originally been classified as an open and shut case of suicide now carried the weight of whispers and doubt, and the inconsistencies in the official narrative began to take on a more troubling significance. The trajectory of the bullet, the lack of gunshot residue on Rachel's dominant hand, and the physical placement of the gun all suggested that the version of events laid out by Michael Jensen might not just be incomplete. It might be fundamentally false. The autopsy report was reviewed again, this time by an independent forensic pathologist brought in by Rachel's family. The new review focused specifically on two things: the angle of the wound and the gunpowder patterns found around it. The conclusion: while not definitive, the evidence leaned strongly toward the shot being fired from an arm's length distance, not from a self-inflicted position. Moreover, there was bruising on Rachel's wrist and forearms, consistent with someone grabbing or restraining her shortly before death. These were not minor bruises. They were fresh. They told a story, a different one. Investigators began combing through Michael's interview tapes again. In his first statement, Michael claimed he and Rachel had been arguing, that she was emotionally overwhelmed, that she had gone into the bedroom and locked the door. But there was no lock on that door. When asked about this later, he adjusted his story slightly, saying she had closed the door hard and that he had gone in after her because he wanted to give her space. He claimed he was outside on the front porch when he heard the shot. Yet, in the 911 call, the sounds of a television playing in the background suggested he was inside the home. When pressed on that, he said he had probably left it on when he went out. The contradictions weren't huge, but they piled up. And more importantly, they didn't sit right with those who knew Michael and Rachel's relationship from the inside. Rachel's co-worker Melissa Doyle came forward with something she had hesitated to mention before. 2 weeks prior to Rachel's death, Melissa and Rachel had gone for drinks after work, and Rachel broke down in the parking lot before getting into her car. She said Michael had been checking her phone, asking where she was every hour, accusing her of hiding things. She had started leaving her phone at work on purpose, just to get some air. She told Melissa, "He's not hitting me, but sometimes I wonder if I'd even know the difference anymore. He talks like I'm his property. Why? He says I owe him for everything." These weren't the kinds of concerns that vanish overnight. They linger, they escalate. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Michael's phone records, texts, and location data. What they found only deepened the sense that the truth was buried far beneath the surface. On the night before Rachel's death, Michael had searched online for how long after a gunshot can someone be revived in staging a suicide scene. Those searches were deleted, but they were recoverable through the cloud sync that Michael had forgotten to disable. In that moment, the direction of the investigation shifted. Police no longer had a suicide with unanswered questions. They had a potential homicide with an obvious suspect and a timeline that was beginning to collapse. And yet Michael maintained his innocence. In a follow-up interview, he became visibly agitated when asked about Rachel's plans to move out. He denied knowing anything about it, despite texts between Rachel and her sister discussing the logistics of moving her boxes the upcoming weekend. When confronted with the digital evidence, he said he was simply curious, that he had been searching those terms because he was scared Rachel might try something. He stuck to his story. He wasn't there when she pulled the trigger. He didn't see it happen. That wasn't entirely true either. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's Ring camera, collected late in the investigation, showed Michael leaving the house at 9:11 a.m. 4 minutes after the reported time of the gunshot, Key told police he was already outside when it happened. but the footage clearly showed him exiting the house, keys in hand, no sign of distress, no running, no panic. As the investigation stretched into its third month, the case of Rachel Green's death had evolved far beyond the tragic but quiet narrative of a woman lost to despair. It had become a slow-burning fire of questions that refused to be extinguished, a puzzle with just enough missing pieces to delay resolution, but not enough to allow peace. The new timeline, the shifting statements, the forensic evidence that all pointed toward a story that had been carefully constructed. One designed not to reveal the truth, but to camouflage it. Then, unexpectedly, came a moment that would shift the trajectory of the case. While reviewing Rachel's cloud data, which had been partially accessed through her workplace laptop, a forensic investigator discovered a set of voicemail. Backups, most of them routine old appointment, reminders, missed calls, and one nearly deleted file marked as transcript unavailable. The message had been left at 7:42 a.m. on the morning of her death. It was a voicemail Rachel had left on her sister's number, which had gone unanswered at the time. And what it captured sent chills through everyone involved. The recording began with silence, just ambient noise. Then Rachel's voice came through, low and rushed, as if she were trying not to be heard. "He's getting worse. I don't know what to do. He told me if I left, I'd regret it," said. "He said he wouldn't let me just walk out. I'm scared. If anything happens, please know I didn't choose this. I was ready. I was ready to go." Click, that was it. Those 27 seconds changed everything. It wasn't a farewell. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a warning. A final breadcrumb dropped in the hope that someone, somewhere, would understand what she couldn't say aloud. Rachel's family pushed hard for the case to be reopened fully as a homicide. With new momentum, authorities filed a warrant to search Michael Jensen's property more thoroughly, including his garage, vehicles, and a locked storage unit he had failed to mention. Inside that unit, officers found several large plastic bin items Rachel had packed weeks earlier, labeled with masking tape, books, office supplies, photo albums, all things she had planned to move to her new apartment. Michael had told police they hadn't started packing yet, but here it was neatly boxed, hidden away, as if he was trying to erase any evidence she had ever been preparing to leave him. But what stood out most wasn't what was inside the bins, it was what was under them. A crumpled plastic shopping bag, and inside it, a torn page from Rachel's journal. It wasn't just any page, it was a letter addressed to herself. "Dear me, if you're reading this, it means you stayed too long. You kept making excuses. You told yourself he'd change. You let the fear control you. You are not broken. You deserve more than this. You deserve to breathe." And below it, scrawled hastily in different ink, "I'm leaving July 17th. No more delays. No more fear." Rachel had died on July 16th. For detectives, this was no longer a matter of doubt. It was a pattern, a digital, emotional, and physical record of intent, fear, and resistance. Rachel had been making plans, documenting her thoughts, warning others in quiet, coded ways. Her death wasn't the story of a woman giving up. It was the story of a woman preparing to live again, silenced in the very moment she tried to reclaim her freedom. Meanwhile, Michael's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Though he had not been charged, he had lawyered up, refused further interviews, and had begun making statements to local media insisting he was being framed, calling the investigation a witch hunt driven by grief. It would take nearly 8 months from the morning Rachel Green was found dead before the district attorney formally announced charges against Michael Jensen's second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. The indictment sent shockwaves through the community, not only because of how long it had taken, because so many people had already made up their minds, one way or another. To some, Rachel's death had always felt suspicious. To others, especially Michael's inner circle, it was a tragic misreading of a complicated relationship. Michael was arrested without incident in his driveway, carrying a gym bag and a grocery list. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply looked straight ahead, his jaw locked, as officers read him his rights, and neighbors stood silently across the street. The man who had, for months, maintained his innocence in quiet interviews, In carefully worded statements, now found himself at the center of a legal storm with no more room to hide behind ambiguity. The trial began on a rainy Monday morning. Porters lined the sidewalk outside the courthouse, and Rachel's family filed in through the side entrance, flanked by friends, supporters, and advocates from domestic violence awareness groups who had taken an interest in the case. They held signs, wore pins. Many of them had never met Rachel, but they knew her story all too well. They had lived it in different forms. The prosecution's case was built slowly and meticulously, brick by brick, just like Rachel's journal entries. They introduced the voicemail Rachel left just hours before her death. They read passages from her journal aloud. They showed the surveillance footage of Michael leaving the house after the shot, not before contradicting his claim that he had been outside when she took her life. They called medical experts who explained, in clinical but chilling detail, how the angle of the gunshot made the suicide scenario highly unlikely. And then came the surprise witness, someone no one, not even the defense, had seen coming. Her name was Erin Thomas. She had dated Michael Jensen more than a decade earlier, when they were both in their early 20s. They had only been together for 6 months, but what she described in her testimony mirrored Rachel's final journal entries in disturbing ways. Control, isolation, emotional volatility masked as concern, subtle threats, constant suspicion. She told the jury that Michael had once told her during an argument, "If I can't have you the way I want you, no one will." It was a moment she had buried for years, so she saw Rachel's photo on the news. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to draw a line through Michael's pattern of behavior, enough to establish intent, enough to erode any benefit of the doubt. The defense focused heavily on Rachel's mental health history. They pointed to old prescriptions, past counseling records, and attempted to paint a portrait of a woman who had battled depression for years. But what they failed to account for was the undeniable narrative Rachel herself had left behind. She wasn't descending, she was rising. She had been scared, yes, but also determined. She had plans. She had an exit strategy. And every document, every message, every word she had recorded before her death made one thing heartbreakingly clear. She wanted to live. In the final moments of the trial, Rachel's sister Sarah was given the opportunity to read a statement aloud to the court. She stood behind the podium, her voice steady, and said, "My sister's life was not a tragedy until someone else made it one." She spent her last days trying to take her life back. And in those final moments, I believe she realized that no matter how quiet her voice had been, it still mattered. She still mattered. And now we're here to make sure no one forgets that. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned after 29 hours of deliberation, 2.5 days that stretched across a weekend and kept an entire town on edge. During that time, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Podcasts speculated on verdicts, and social media threads erupted with theories and outrage. But inside the courtroom, the mood was still and tight, like the air had been vacuum sealed. Rachel's family sat side by side, their fingers laced tightly together. Eyes fixed on the jury foreman as he unfolded the slip of paper. Guilty, on all counts. There was no gasp, no cheers. Just the soft exhale of a truth that had taken nearly a year to be spoken aloud in a way that mattered. The judge called for order, but there was nothing to contain. The reaction was quiet, heavy, real. Michael Jensen didn't flinch. He stood with his attorney, shoulders squared as if waiting to be told the weather. He showed no emotion, no sign of surprise, no acknowledgement of the weight of what had just happened. It's only after the courtroom was cleared did he request to address the judge directly. What came next stunned everyone. Michael spoke for the first time since his arrest, not to apologize, not to confess, but to reassert his version of the story. He said, "I loved Rachel. It hurt her. I've been vilified by people who never knew what went on between us. You've only heard one side." But even as he spoke, he failed to mention her name again. He didn't speak of her as a person, only as a figure in a story he could no longer control. The judge, unmoved, sentenced Michael Jensen to 40 years to life. No parole eligibility for at least 38 years. But the story didn't end in that courtroom. What followed in the weeks and months after the trial was a ripple effect of awareness and change. Rachel's story made national headlines, not because she was famous, but because she was painfully familiar. She became a symbol of every woman who had felt her voice shrink behind closed doors, of every journal never read until it was too late, of every moment someone tried to leave but didn't get the chance. Rachel's sister, Sarah, launched the Greenlight Project hand outreach program focused on recognizing the unseen signs of emotional control and psychological abuse. It partnered with therapists, domestic violence shelters, and tech developers to create an app that could discreetly log warning signs and journal entries in the cloud, invisible to anyone who might try to erase them. 1 year after Rachel's death, Candlelight Vigil was held in the park, where she had once taken morning walks, back when her life felt simple, possible, unbroken. Hundreds of people showed up. Some held signs. Others brought notebooks, placing them near the memorial. Blank pages. Pages that said, "I'm listening." Because Rachel Green wasn't just a name on a headline. She was a person, messy, kind, scared, hopeful. And though her voice had been silenced in life, it roared louder than ever in the aftermath. Thank you for watching this episode. Rachel Green's story reminds us that silence can be deceiving and that behind even the quietest smiles, there can be a struggle no one sees until it's too late. But her life was more than how it ended. It was filled with effort, with courage, with the hope of starting over. And in the end, her voice still found a way to be heard. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people discover stories that deserve to be remembered. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and most importantly, leave a comment below. Your voice matters here. Every time you speak, someone else listens. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you're re-notified the moment our next true crime episode drops. We tell real stories not just about crime, but about people, about truth, and about the things that should never be forgotten. We'll see you in the next one.